Well, welcome to this episode, and we are joined by a special guest, a returning guest, as a matter of fact, because we had him on last year to talk about kind of the same subject, but a little bit different. We're going to go in a different tone here. I am joined by everyone's favorite. I mean, come on. If you are studying World War II, we've got Mr. World War II, Mr. 1942 himself, Jon Parshall. Jon, it is great to have you, your shirt, your wallpaper. We got everything. And in the background there, 1942, Crux of War. Hang on a second. Let me get my copy here. I'm going to get my copy. Hang on a second.
Let's do it.
Gentlemen, back it in. It's coming in now. Hang on a second. Hang on a second. There we go. I got it right here. Oh. Jon, can I be clear? The box this came in had a warning on it.
Right.
4.9 pounds.
Yeah.
4.9 pounds. I downloaded the Kindle version onto my tablet.
It's heavy.
It's a pound heavier. It's a pound heavier now. Yeah.
All the pixels, all the words. I use them all.
This is when you talked about this book, and I've listened to you talk about this book for a long time, and the talk you would have with Seth all the time, and it's like, okay, Jon's talking a lot about this book. Holy crap, man! This thing is absolute. I don't even think I used to joke about. What's his name's book? World at Arms with Gerhard Weinberg.
Gerhard Weinberg, yeah, right.
And it's like, okay, this is the biggest book you'll ever see on World War II. I stand corrected, man. And let me say kudos on this. Hats off, dude.
Thank you.
What an achievement.
I appreciate it. It is ridiculous, though. And I do have to say, so I laid out and designed the whole book myself. It's published by Oxford, but Oxford was just kind of like, you go do your thing. And so as it was coming together in the fall of 2025, I'm just kind of looking at it being birthed with this mixture of wonder and horror. It's just like I knew it was going to be big, but I didn't know it was going to be this big. Dear Lord. Because it is 1,280 pages. It's
it is, I got it here. 1,074 pages of text. I mean, and can I be clear? It is one of the most beautiful books laid out. I'm not kidding, Jon. I went through the index. I've obviously got it just this week it came in, and I've leafed through it and I've read sections of it, and we're going to talk about this in a minute. But it is, the maps are. Man, I can't tell you how much I love the maps in this book. I've been reading so many books recently where I've got to literally get my phone or my computer out because I got to have a map up to go along with it. And it's such a pain. People are talking about things. I'm reading one right now in like New Georgia. It's like if you don't have a map on New Georgia, you're screwed. There's no way you're following this. And the maps, and I know you did the maps, and they are, just absolutely stellar. I don't know what to say more than that. And then I love little tiny things, Jon. The tabs. I love my little tabs here for month.
Yeah.
I think each of those represent a chapter in this book.
Yeah.
And those are great. I just absolutely love that.
Well, I appreciate that because, one of the things I'm trying to do, it's such a big book that you've got to give the reader as many navigational aids as possible. And so the little tabs are like, I'm sure a lot of people would be, where the hell am I? Oh, I'm in May. My little tab says I'm in May, so anyway.
It's on the side of the page where you're at and everything. And listen, it's laid out. You've got, specific theaters that you follow almost religiously in each chapter. And it's a month by month, so it's more than 12 chapters, because you got a precursor chapters, you got the conclusion. But it lays out really, really well. And one of the things I get worried about when I read chronological histories is, okay, is this going to be seamless? Are we going to be able to transition really well? And I thought you did that great. I thought
Thank you.
That was really well done. And I love, and we're going to come back to this, your kind of fundamental questions that you laid out. Yes. One of the things I've got, one of my personal gripes with reading a book is go through an entire book is like, okay, what did I get out of this? What am I supposed to know? You have, at the beginning of this, laid out fundamental questions for each of the 7 major nations. And again, kudos to you for including China, because I think that's always a big one.
Yeah. They're important in 42, for sure. Yeah.
So crucial, and we're going to talk about that. But more importantly, you deal with those questions, not just at the end of the book, but throughout the book. When all of a sudden you hit a major kind of point, it's like, okay, fundamental question answered or fundamental question raised. Here we go. And I thought that was so good. It was great. Again, I apologize, Jon. I have not read all 1,074 pages in a week. So I'm a slacker, Jon. I'm a slacker. I just haven't done it yet.
Yeah. Yeah. No, the book is not trying to do just one argument. And so, again, from a navigational standpoint, I thought it was really important that, yeah, when we get to one of those questions and we answer it, it's like, okay, let me draw you back to the introduction again. We were going to talk about this. Here we've got the answer to it. And that sort of leads into a sort of a larger thesis around the book. One of the things I'm arguing is there were no turning points in the Second World War. That we have this tendency to overfocus, I think, on battles like Midway, for instance, of, oh, turning points. And like, yeah, but what the hell does that mean in the context of a war this big? And so one of the arguments I'm making is that it was really a whole collection of inflection points that ends up turning this massive man of war onto a new course during the course of this year. That really the whole year is a turning point, if you will, but it's assembled from all these other little individual events, most of which aren't even battles. They're really larger level questions around economics and, can the Germans get oil, can the, stuff like that. So yeah, I felt it was important to be able to refer the reader back to the introduction when we do reach those sort of inflections.
No, I love that part in the introduction where you did it. I mean, because you talked about like okay, here are the two big events that are happening. You got Pearl Harbor and the counterattack at Moscow, and then you get into that issue about, listen, 1942 is this collective event here this year. And I thought it was great. The other thing that you did I thought was so good is capture the scale of this thing. And what was amazing is how you could change scale in this book. So 1 minute, I'm reading. So like one of the sections I read on the Eastern Front I wanted to look at was the Kerch, was read about Kerch and the Crimea, because that's a really interesting campaign. Doesn't get a lot of attention. Everything's kind of, overblown by Moscow and Stalingrad, but it was a really interesting viewpoint there. And you're looking at armies and army groups moving, and then next minute you're at a company level in Alligator Creek and Guadalcanal, and it's like it's
yeah.
But at the same time, it's like it's really hard to get that company into Guadalcanal because of the logistics and everything associated with it. Whereas we can do army level combat here, a couple hundred miles from Moscow and a couple hundred miles from Berlin, a little bit easier. It's still tough.
Yeah.
But it's just the scale is crazy, where you're in a handful of soldiers in this one battle and thousands, in this other battle. It was amazing to kind of get that perspective.
Well, and one of the things you kind of have to come to peace with if you're going to write a book like this is that if you were to divvy up your word count or your page count just strictly on the number of soldiers that were involved, the book would be 80% about the Eastern Front, right? But the countervailing piece to that is that if you look at the size of the Japanese Empire by May of 1942, it encompasses as many human beings as the British Empire does. You're talking about 500 million people, which is about a quarter of the world's population, which means that proportionately, that smaller number of divisions out here in the Pacific, the British, the Americans, the Japanese, what have you, are playing for substantially larger odds in terms of the numbers of human lives that they are actually affecting. And so, yeah, just because Alligator Creek is a battalion-sized action doesn't mean that it's unimportant. It actually, it's super important to how the Pacific War as a whole goes, and sort of painting what the nature of the combat there is going to be. But I also agree that it's really hard to write about the Eastern Front in any sort of human terms, because the number of people is just so large that you end up resorting to these sort of literary tropes almost, like this army sliced through that army. And I talk about that very thing. It's like, how the hell does an army even slice, And you need to continually keep in mind that all of these large-scale actions are composed of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of little tactical actions, a couple hundred human beings battling another couple hundred human beings, and that's how the bigger pizza is actually baked.
Right, and I think you capture that, and the fact that you put it all into perspective: the Eastern Front, the air war over Germany, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, the Pacific. I mean, again, it really creates that balance, and it's difficult. It's difficult to stage some of these operations. You know, the British in North Africa, the Japanese going into Burma. You know, all those are really difficult to do, and sometimes, you know, this is the force you can get. You can't get, you know, you're invading Burma with a division,
Right.
you know, or defending it with a division. It's the size of France. I mean, it's crazy. It's like you're defending the entire country of Burma with one British division. It's like, good luck, you know. It's
Yeah. Peace. Have fun with it. Yeah.
the scale is massive. So I want to read one thing you wrote because it caught me on page one, John, because we're going to go page by page here. This will take a while, so we're going to go through it.
Okay. Yeah.
But I love this because you wrote this. Those familiar with my Midway book will recall my counseling readers at the start of the third chapter to pour themselves a rather tall glass of spirits before wading in. For this book, I advise not waiting, but locating a comfy chair and deploying your refreshments of choice now. I think that is a great caveat for before reading any good book, but this is a great one for that.
I appreciate that. And that sort of speaks to a larger issue. Again, if I'm going to somehow lure a reader into wading through 1,000 pages of book with me, it's got to have a convivial tone. It's got to be conversational. There's got to be bits of humor sprinkled in there. I will tell you that there are a number of Easter eggs kind of sprinkled through the text. I'm particularly fond of one of the punch quotes at the beginning of the July chapter at the very bottom. I'll just lay that out there. Anyway, so yeah, the book as a whole, I try to keep conversational. It's, you know, we're yakking at a bar about this kind of stuff because it's just so big that it isn't feasible any other way. No one wants to be lectured at for 1,000 pages, but
right.
Yeah.
Well, and you know, again, looking at it, it's both a narrative read and a quick reference too. And let me tell you, the bibliography for me is one of the first things I do is always go back into a bibliography and start ripping it through it. And holy cow, man, you have hit. I mean, not just books, but articles, everything in there.
Yeah.
And so I mean, it was in depth, man. I mean, I was again, you're not doing this is not so much a primary source.
No
book. This is very much on the secondary source level. So for a historical bibliography, if I'm doing a World War II class and I need students to know what books to read in World War II, man, I got that list right here for them now.
Right. Yeah, well, and that's actually a point that makes me a little uncomfortable because those who are familiar with my Midway book, you know, that I wrote with Tony, that was down in the weeds in the primary sources, particularly the air group records and that kind of stuff. But this particular book, you can't really do it that way because if you tried to assemble this from archival sources, first of all, I'd have to be able to speak about 7 different languages, yeah, including, you know, Romanian and Chinese and, you know, what have you. And I'd also have to have about 4 lifetimes to get it done. It's just, it just ain't feasible that way. So the exercise really was, okay, read all the official histories from whatever side that are currently in English, along with some Senshi Sosho in Japanese, and then
I'm glad you mentioned that because I'm gonna push back on you a little bit on that, John, because I think you do that primary. I mean, Senshi Sosho, which you talk about all the time, I mean, it's really essential. You were getting into Japanese primary sources, and to be clear, the Soviet side, I mean, you got guys like House and Glantz, and a lot of people went into those archives, got out, put the secondary source material out there. So it really was. I mean, I don't think it was really necessary for you to push into the primary source in a lot of other areas because you were doing it in the area, I think, where there was a lack, which is in Japan. I think you'll agree with me. The one area that's probably still lacking quite a bit is China. That's always the one that's the toughest one to do it, but we are seeing some material come out now and a little bit more detail in that. But I think on the Japanese side, which is, you know, kind of your expertise area, was really good. And I got to say, for you to take that jump from Midway to dealing with the Eastern Front, to dealing with the Mediterranean, to dealing with China, that's a big one. It is a tough thing to look at. So.
Yeah, no, it was a bit of a leap, and but part of the reason for this book really was that I wanted to educate myself. And so I knew it was going to be a really big process, and I do still feel somewhat uncomfortable about both the Eastern Front and the air war. I mean, those are not, you know, my traditional strength areas, but I guess I was heartened that, the book was reviewed by a number of people. Jonathan House was one of the people that read over the Eastern Front. And if Jonathan House, puts his seal of approval on it, I feel a whole lot more comfortable that I actually know what the hell I'm talking about there. So,
Oh, it's a who's who on the back page there of who read this, and
yeah.
you definitely had some great people there, and it's published by Oxford, so I've heard of Oxford. It seems to be a reputable band.
It seems to be.
Of publishers.
Yeah. No, I am very proud of that, I will say. For a guy that doesn't have a PhD, to get a book published by Oxford, that was great. And I have to say they were great to work with too. Again, they just were kind of like, Parshall did Shattered Sword. He clearly knows what he's doing. If we're going to do this proposal, this is what, my editor basically told his sort of council of editors. If we're gonna do this book, we're gonna do it the way Parshall wants to do it, or we're not going to do it at all. And so they just were like, you go do you. And this enormous book dumped out at the end, and they're like, oh, okay, cool. We do big books. So I was super, super fortunate to be able to work with them. They were great.
Well, I mean, your bar was set with Shattered Sword. What you and Tully did was absolutely just absolutely changed the paradigm in many ways about Midway. And you have a presence too. And I think I joke when I had you on the channel last year. Everybody's like, Jon Parshall on, I'm watching. That's it. It's a great one because of the attitude that you have and what you bring and what you and Seth do over at the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War is fantastic. I do question some of the guests you had last season. There was one showed up twice. I think you guys are scraping the bottom of the barrel now. I think you guys you could do better and everything. You're in the midst of doing my favorite topic right now, which is the early war, Philippines. You're getting ready to talk about Asiatic fleet. Loving that.
Yeah.
But let's dive into some questions. So what I thought would be fun is kind of just ask you, and there's no way we're going to be answering all of these. Just kind of maybe about 5-10 minutes on each of these questions.
Yeah.
Kind of fundamental questions you put out there on each of the countries, because I love that. I love the way you did this. And I thought it'd be fun to kind of take a look at this and get your little perspective, whet the appetite, of the reader to go out there and take a look at it more.
Yeah, okay, let's do that. Yeah.
So kind of looking at it chronologically, how the war goes, and we'll start off with China first. And I thought one of the best questions you had there was, after 4 years fighting almost entirely on its own, could China survive another year of war with Japan? And I don't think everyone realizes, and we've had this conversation before, the role China plays, the really unheralded role, and how precarious the situation was with China. Talk about, literally they're hanging on by a thin string, which is the Burma Road, and that goes away. So I'll let you run with this.
Yeah, I think, and this is something that Rich Frank has really tried to do in his forthcoming trilogy. He's got the first book out now, Tower of Skulls, and Rich and I are very good friends and have talked about this over the course of many years, but within the context of just 1942, China is incredibly important to the overall Allied bloc, in that the Russians are on the ropes, right? Uncle Joe is getting pummeled by the Wehrmacht, and the last thing that he needs is for the Japanese troops in Manchuria to get uppity on him and start attacking him in Siberia. So, and both Churchill and FDR are crucially aware of this, and so in their minds it is absolutely essential that China be kept in the war somehow by hook or crook, just to act as a sump for Japanese manpower in China. Because if those troops are busy fighting the Chinese, they can't be busy fighting the Soviets. As such, that's why Stilwell ends up over in Burma trying to defend the Burma Road, and obviously that's unavailing. The Burma Road does get captured by the Japanese in May or late April of 42, and then immediately we start, the air route across the hump, flying in supplies, because if nothing else, it is important to demonstrate to Shang, hey, we're still with you, brother. We're still going to try to give you as much stuff as we can. Unfortunately for the nationalist government, 42 is really kind of a long-term death knell, I would say, in that once the Burma Road does get captured, there's no way to get supplies in there. And the nationalist economy is so beaten up at this point, their tax base is falling apart, and so that means that unfortunately more and more of their officials are, they're corrupt. They have to supplement their own government incomes with, taking bribes and doing all that kind of stuff. Likewise, Chinese divisions that are out in the field have this nasty habit of kind of, depredating the entire countryside as they're going through there to get the supplies that they need to live. So fast forward, by the time we get to 1944, the nationalist government is going to be really creaky and sclerotic and just, limping along. And that's all as a result of what happens to it during 42.
Yeah, I think you captured that really good. I mean, I love the section on the Battle of Changsha. I thought that was, I think that's an area where, there's not a lot of context when we talk about the Pacific War. It tends to be American focused. It tends to be,
Yes.
Maybe let's talk about ABDA, let's talk about Malaya, let's talk about that, maybe a little bit about Burma, but you get almost nothing about China in there. And Changsha, in conjunction with Hong Kong, was such an interesting. You unravel that really beautifully, John. I thought that was a great kind of piece right there to talk about. And what we're talking about is a battle that takes place early in 42, and which is part of the Hong Kong offensive, and this movement here for really securing supply lines and rail lines and really cutting China off exclusively from outside sources.
Yeah, it's a big land battle. I mean, it involves 3 divisions and a couple of independent mixed brigades on the part of the Japanese. So, this is a force that is easily as large as they used to capture Malaya, and it's larger than what they put into the Philippines. And they're advancing on a city called Changsha, and the Chinese just bring it. They just they almost wipe that army out. And so, here we are in the dark days of the first 3 months of the Asia-Pacific War, and really the only people that win a multi-divisional scale battle during that time are the Chinese, and nobody knows about it.
It's fascinating, and again, it shows you the diversion that Japan has. It's crazy when you start thinking about how much of a sump Japan is fighting. I mean, when they take on the U.S., Great Britain, Australia, and all those nations, and India, and oh, by the way, you're still fighting China, one of the largest country on the world at the time.
Yeah,
and it's just it's incredible. It's really incredible, and it gets so shut out from most histories. And I love that you put it kind of forefront there, front and center.
Yeah,
for talking about it, and again, of course, the impact of the divisions lost in northern Burma with Stilwell being Stilwell. It just
yeah, he was really not on top of his brief at this point. And this is a sort of a larger theme that flows through these first few months, is just the chauvinism of a lot of the Allied generals, American and British alike, that, oh, the Japanese aren't that good, they're ripe for a counterattack. And Stilwell, comes skating into Burma, takes 6 of Chiang's very best divisions and sticks their necks way, way too far out in southern Burma. And guess what? The Japanese are a lot better than you think they are, and they just absolutely shellac him. And they're doing the same to General Slim over in sort of the western portion of Burma as well. Slim is not overconfident, but his first meetings with the Japanese are extremely unpleasant as he comes into contact with General Sakurai's 33rd Division, which is just hands down the best division in that campaign. And 33rd Division just absolutely just waffle stomps him, just stonewalls him. And Slim, to his credit, at least has the honesty after the campaign is over to accurately diagnose all the dumb things that he did, and as he's getting a grip, just, what kind of an enemy is it that I am fighting here? So, yeah. Unfortunately for the nationalists, because Stilwell loses those 6 good divisions, now Chiang no longer really has sort of a critical mass in terms of a reserve force, and that's really going to hurt him in some of the upcoming battles in 43 and 44.
I think the context you put China in is so important because, a lot of historiography now talking about World War II is really talking about the fact that World War II doesn't end in 45. It's actually maybe around 49 when the Chinese Civil War ends because, it's a leftover effect because of the way China was treated and issues associated with that. So that's why one of the reasons I want to bring China in first. I thought it's an interesting one to look at, and you do a great job at targeting that. Second, I want to talk about, let's jump over to the British.
Yeah.
And before we get to the Germans, I want to talk about the British here for a second, because The question for the British: could the Royal Navy contain the U-boat menace, which
Yeah.
threatened to curve Britain into submission? So one of the things you have at the beginning of each chapter, one of my favorites, is that chart you put together where each of the theaters are, and you can look at, kind of for the month, these are the big events going on. So you got a nice little chronology right
Yeah,
there, and one of
timeline.
them is on the U-boat, the Atlantic. If you got ship sunk, U-boat sunk, convoys. And 1942 Battle of the Atlantic. It's friggin' Tom Hanks and Greyhound. This is what we're
Right.
talking about here.
Yeah.
It's Churchill. This is the one battle that I worried the most was the Battle of
Yeah.
the Atlantic. And was Churchill blowing smoke up us, John? What was going on with
Well,
all
and
that?
I think there's still some sort of historical controversy about that from purely a numbers standpoint, you can make the argument that the U-boat battle was unwinnable from the beginning on the part of the Germans. That just the sheer scale of American shipbuilding and blah 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 means that Donuts is just not going to be able to sink enough ships, and anybody should have been able to see that. However, one of my other sort of central contentions in the book is it sure wasn't obvious at the time. And you have to take a lot of these people at their word when they talk about the fact that, we didn't have a good idea of how this war was going to come out. And things that seem obvious to us in 80 years of hindsight, sitting in our comfy chairs, we know how the story comes out, man. You ask any average man or woman on the street in 1942, yeah, do you think the war is going to end with, an absolute Allied walkover in the middle of 1945? They've been like, you're smoking drugs, it's a dumpster fire right now. We're losing everywhere. It's horrific. So, yeah, I still come. I go both ways on the Battle of the Atlantic, honestly. Although I will say that the damage that the Germans do to our tanker fleet has, knock-on effects that last for years and years and years. The other point that I'll make is one that a friend of mine, Gary Giamara, has made, that if you look at the imports into Britain, 42 is a disaster. That the actual the larder is increasingly bare, not only in terms of food but also fuel. And one of the points I do try to make here is that the British had barely managed to come through the first happy time at the beginning of World War II, and had kind of clawed their way back to, by the time you get to the end of 1941, the routes on the northern convoy lines across the North Atlantic are starting to look a little bit better. And then all of a sudden, Paukenschlag kicks off to the U.S. East Coast, and the sinkings just go through the roof. And from the British standpoint, it's like, we don't have a lot of reserves left at this point to go through another one of these heavy cullings of our merchant fleet. And as Roger Wynne, who is the head of their U-boat tracking room, says to some American guests during this time, the problem is, a lot of these ships aren't your ships, they're our ships, and they're being sunk off your coast, So, yeah, I think we do have to take the British at their word, including Churchill, that this was a very scary time for them, and it remains scary throughout all of 42. It's not really going to be resolved until the middle of 43.
I think your point, and you do raise that in the beginning. When I read that section about, okay, you got to put yourself into that historical moment, I go back to one of my favorite movies of all time, which is Apollo 13, but with Tom Hanks. And Tom Hanks seems to be everything. And I remember watching that movie in the theater, and I know the Apollo missions back and forth. I know everything that happens, and I can remember watching that movie, and they're coming into re-entry, and I'm like, these guys aren't going to make it. It's like, that's how good that movie, it caught you into that moment. I think that's what I always try to talk about this with my students all the time, is listen, you got to get yourself into the moment here. Things are not looking good. It's like, this is bad. It's like, nobody knows the future here.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. I mean, the other element with that too is, and you alluded to it there, is like, listen, even with the convoys getting across the Atlantic, there's not enough getting across. It doesn't matter if they're getting sunk if you don't have the volume going across, because imports are down, because the British are and the Allies are stuck fighting this multi-dimensional, multi-front war where they've got to be allocating resources everywhere. and there's just not enough in the cupboard to go everywhere initially. And like you said, you're getting sunk off the coast of the United States, Gulf of Mexico, off the coast of South America with the German U-boat offensive. You've got to go all this huge long distance. It's a pain to get to Russia because the distance is involved. You can't turn around very fast. You got to get to North Africa, which you can't go through the Med, so you got to go around Africa. I mean, it's just this long, and we talked about logistics on your show with the Pacific. It is so tough.
Yeah.
And I think, just any sort of hindrance that the Germans throw up in terms of U-boat offensive is enough to cause consternation and difficulty. And yet maybe they're not sinking the tonnage they were doing in World War One. Maybe they weren't close to starving Britain, but man, I mean, like you said, British imports are down. I mean, Torch is a huge pull from them. It's like you're diverting so much away from us at Torch that we're literally going on rations here. We're so hungry that we're pulling so much away to undertake this North Africa invasion, which everyone has this intention that Churchill is pulling the rug over Roosevelt and this is what he wants to do, but it's a huge gamble for them to go ahead and do that.
It really is. I mean, Torch, and there's another point I want to make about Paukenschlag, and I'll try to come back to that. But Torch, to me, was just one of... Okay, so Torch, for the sake of our readers, is the Allied invasion of North Africa in November of 1942. We land in Morocco and Tunisia and Algeria. The part of that just sort of blows me away even now is that the American component of that invasion is being launched from Hampton freaking Roads, right? And this is an operation. Understand, we didn't come to agreement with the British on this is what we're going to do until July of 1942. And when Marshall goes back to Eisenhower and is like, okay, this is what we're going to do. The planners on the American side of the pond for the first month or so were like, no, we're not really going to do that. We can't possibly do that. This is blah, 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 blah. And so we just throw this plan together in the course of like 2.5 months. And we're loading these guys onto ships and all of this, stuff. And we gotta take everything with us, construction materials and food and munitions and coffee and condoms and whatever, it's all got to be put on ships and sent over there. And we're launching this thing from the other side of the Atlantic Ocean that is lousy with Donitz's U-boats. I mean, it's astonishing. And yet the fact that it ends up working, I think, is a real indicator that, whoa, the U.S. is a burgeoning world superpower. We have the ability to project power across oceans, even oceans that are contested. That's pretty amazing.
It's trans-hemispheric.
Yeah.
I mean, how often do you do that?
Yeah, and
it's amazing when you think about it.
And by the way, we're also fighting this campaign down in Guadalcanal, which is 6,500 miles away from San Francisco. I mean, oh my Lord.
I mean, and if you think about it, the only amphibious invasions we have under our belt is like Ironclad at Madagascar and Guadalcanal, and it's like okay, those worked, but were they great? It's probably not, and we probably had issues with all of them. But here we go. Let's do this from Great Britain. Let's do it from the United States. And as you said, contested seas. U-boats are November 42. U-boats are in their peak right there. Yeah. You're going into the Med. By the way, there's an Italian fleet in there that no one's quite 100% sure what's going to happen there.
Yeah.
And again, no telling how the French are going to react with the French fleet at the same time.
Right. I'm glad you brought up Madagascar because that actually plays into the larger point I would make about Paukenschlag is that there's been a tendency, I think, particularly on the British side of the scholarship, to really point the fingers of blame at Ernest King and, God damn it, why didn't you get convoying started sooner? And, we lost all these ships off the U.S. East Coast and it was a catastrophe and it's all your fault and blah, 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 blah. And I do think that King should have started convoying, particularly of tankers, probably in the early April, late March timeframe, something like that. But one of the things that gets lost in this whole conversation is that the British were creating a lot of obligations for our naval forces that often go unrecognized. So, for instance, Tirpitz is lurking up in the Norwegian fjords, and the British King George V class battleships don't stack up particularly well against that puppy. And so, lo and behold, we send a carrier and a battleship up to Scapa Flow, and they're sitting up there until, July. We use the Wasp to shuttle Spitfires to the island of Malta inside the Mediterranean, not once but twice in the early part of the year. And you can imagine what Ernest King thought about sending one of his aircraft carriers into, this Stuka-infested lake, in the Mediterranean. He hated that notion. Likewise, Operation Ironclad, the invasion of Madagascar, which happens in May of 42, is sucking away all these British forces from both Scapa Flow and from Gibraltar. And, the American Navy is kind of left minding the store. And that means that for all of these heavy units that are around here, we've got to dedicate destroyers to escort them and so forth and so on. So it's no wonder that we don't have enough assets on our own East Coast, because other people are creating obligations for us. Thank you very much. And that is the nature of coalition warfare. I mean, we're covering for our partner here while they're off doing something that we think is hopefully marginally useful. But the fact that the British don't do a terribly good job at acknowledging all of those obligations and instead just focus on what's happening off of the East Coast, as I say in the book, I think is a little bit uncharitable.
No, I think you're right. I mean, I think the commitments, and again, a book like yours puts that grand strategy into place, and you talk about that at the beginning of each chapter. Is like, what's going on? How's this all fitting together?
Yeah.
Because you're right. I mean, there's only so many pieces you have to move around the chessboard, and something's going to be bare, and you got to leave something undefended, and it winds up being the east and almost the west coast of the United States. And even then, you still have to prioritize. I mean, I mean, you read some of these things. They're worried about the French aircraft carrier burn down in Martinique and Panama Canal. I mean, there's crazy things. They're escorting, the 18th Division of the British Army over to Singapore on American ships with parts of the American fleet doing it.
Right.
And like you said, they're getting pulled. And more importantly, hey, we've got to get American forces into Great Britain faster so that British forces can go and fight in North Africa. So you got to get the 34th Infantry. You got to get the 1st Armored over. I mean, it's sometimes hard when you look at just a theater or an area to understand. You got to look at the global picture on how this all fits together. And I think that's a great piece that you have right there. All right, let's talk about our favorite ones here, which is the Germans for a second. One of the points you made could the Wehrmacht survive and then recover from the Red Army's counterattack outside the gates of Moscow? So this is one of those two events you talk about at the very beginning of the book. It's Pearl Harbor and then the counterattack outside. And obviously a big, huge seminal moment here. Everybody's watching this. This is the thing that captures everybody's attention. It's the thing that sucks a lot of, the air out of World War II is obviously this Eastern Front.
Yeah.
And the fact that, the Germans and the Russians are 80% of all the combat forces here. But there's also a couple of myths surrounding this, which I love you go into a little bit and talk a little bit about it. It's the army from Manchuria coming over. Go ahead, I'll let you riff with this.
Yeah. Well, and let me preface that too by saying that another one of the things that the book is trying to do at sort of a large scale level is push back a little bit on the whole notion of what I would call Eastern Front determinism, which is to say that it's been popular, I would argue, within the last 15 to 20 years that with the failure of Operation Barbarossa in, pick your time, either the summer or the fall of 1941, depending on which scholar you're reading, that therefore the notion goes that the Germans can no longer beat the Red Army, and therefore World War II is done. It's over. And I'm like, that just it's ridiculous, because you're basically saying that this war is in the bag for the Allies before the Americans and the Japanese are even in the war. Okay, so I have a problem with that right off the bat. And the other thing that I think it fails to look at is just there's a lot of contingencies here that have to be played out in 1942. Are the series of military reforms that the Red Army put in place starting in July of 1941 really going to bear fruit? Is Lend-Lease aid going to remain in place at the level that it ended up remaining in place during 1942? And most important of all, I think there's a tendency to overfocus on the military aspects of the Eastern Front and underfocus on the economic aspects, because the wheels absolutely could have fallen off the Soviet economy during that year. And in fact, I would argue that the circumstantial evidence points to the fact that it damn near did. That one of the sort of data points is that if you look at the rate of extrajudicial killings that happens within the Soviet Union, obviously at the beginning of the Great Terror in 1937-38 under Yezhov, there's this huge spike, a lot of people being killed, blah, blah, blah. It kind of goes back down by the time you get to 1940 and kind of burbles along. You get to 42 and there's another noticeable spike. And I would argue that Stalin does not repress for fun. Stalin represses when he is scared and angry about the way things are going. And so I would argue that by the time you get to the middle of the summer of 1942, Stalin is telling the NKVD and Smersh, you got to keep the lid on this mother. Things are bad. And, so they're hunting down food criminals. They're really bearing down on people. And it's a result of the fact that the domestic economy is really in bad shape here. Anyway, so yeah, back to your original point. Can the Germans actually resurrect themselves? They have a terrible winter. But one of the things that David Stahel would argue in his books on the Eastern Front is that if you look at the Soviet counteroffensive outside Moscow that then widens to be this, it goes all across the entire Eastern Front, that in terms of the body count that the Soviets pay for all of these little villages that they end up taking back out in front of Moscow, it's just a ruinous cost. And that the Germans actually came through that winter counteroffensive having done better at their strategic goals than the Soviets did. So that's data point number one. If you fast forward then to what ends up happening at some of the battles, we talked about Kerch, which is a disaster for the Russians, then it's happening at just right before Kharkov, which is another disaster for the Russians. And then finally, in early July, when the Germans kick off Operation Blau down in the south of Russia, to all outward appearances, and again, we have to put ourselves in this moment, right? To all outward appearances, the Red Army is falling apart. The Germans are pushing through the Donbass. They are advancing towards the Caucasus. They're advancing towards Stalingrad. And ex post facto, the Soviets, labeled this as a strategic retreat. But I would argue that what's really going on here, and a lot of other scholars would too, is that no, really what's going on is a lot of these Red Army units are like, we know how this story is supposed to turn out. We saw what happened last summer when there were these enormous kettle battles that, formed and sucked 1 million guys away at a stroke. We're not waiting around for that. Peace, we out, and they're sidestepping and getting across the Don River and just kind of letting the Germans, roar ahead into the Kalmyk steppe. So did the Germans manage to resurrect themselves? Yes and no. I mean, they still had sufficient operational moxie that when they were able to do their thing out in the open in the south of Russia, they could do their thing. But ultimately, because of the design of Operation Blau, it is not. They don't create these enormous kettle battles anymore, and the overall goal is to kill the Red Army. We hit it again so hard this summer that it finally, falls dead, and that does not happen.
Yeah, and because that's the interesting element, because you look at the initial 41 attack by the Wehrmacht, they're destroying armies. That's what they want to do. They're encircling, destroying armies. And in some ways, the Soviets are learning how to retreat. They're learning how to stretch out that German army, because that German army has a distance, and there's a chord to it. It can only go so far. And it's true of all armies. I mean, the U.S. runs into the same thing when they invade in 1944 in France, and they hit the, they get to the French border. They've run out of, logistics. Yeah. And they got to restock, and it's kind of the same things. And plus, can the Germans even get oil out of the Caucasus, which I don't think they can.
Right.
It's a whole element there, and I think it's a really interesting one to look at, because again, that 1942 offensive by the Germans is scary. I mean, it is massive in scale.
It's really scary.
It is that, and I also go back to that issue we were just talking about, is you can't know how this ends.
Right.
World War I, you fought France to a standstill. Well, in World War II, France falls in 4 months.
Yep.
in World War One, Russia falls. It's like, well,
Yes.
Hitler's got to be thinking like, well, if I can knock out France in World War Two, I can knock out Russia. I just got to let them internally implode because that's what happened in World War
Right.
One. It's kind of what happened with France in World War Two. That you start getting the internal implosion, excuse me, inside them,
Yeah.
and you just got to add the military element to it. And I don't think, like you said, that the war is over when you don't get into Moscow. I
Right.
think there's always that political element, that X factor that's at play.
I would say too that yeah, July is when Stalin issues the famous Order Number 227, not a step back, right? And I think the conventional interpretation around that order is that this was intended to put some steel in the spine of the Red Army, and get them to fight harder. But if you read the actual text of that order, it is framed almost purely in economic terms. Stalin is talking about the fact that the Soviet Union is not a desert. It is full of cities and people and factories that are making, it's metal, it's bread. He uses the word bread 7 different times in the course of that order, which speaks to the fact that there's widespread malnutrition and starvation going on in the Soviet Union during this time. So that to me is another data point. Basically what Stalin, I think, is saying is, what we did last year was we traded away 40% of our economy and 40% of our population to buy the time to rearm and, hopefully get better. We cannot play that same card again this summer. We ain't got that much of an economy left to trade away. So y'all have got to fight harder because we cannot keep losing these economic nodes within the Soviet Union or we're going to fall apart.
And that's where that Lend-Lease comes in, I think, to fill the gap there where Russia can prioritize what they have to do and fill the excess with what's coming in. And again, it's one of those arguments as Lend-Lease win the war. Does it? I think it's all part of it. It's like, as you said, it's all pieces in this puzzle that comes together. It's not one thing, but it's all of it together. And I think you see that with the Wehrmacht running into that logistical strain that they have. They have limits. They just have these limits. And it goes to that short war mentality they have where they want to fight a war, be done with it, and go on to the next thing. They are not geared to fight a multi-year kind of conflict, which is what they find themselves sucked into with the Soviet Union. It's the exact thing after 42 they can't do, is get into that attrition war.
And that's really a problem for all 3 of the Axis powers. I mean, the Japanese likewise knew that they needed to get this thing over with, during the first year or so, or they're in big trouble. Likewise, the Italians had gotten into the war back in 1940. Mussolini assures his general staff that, the war's going to be over in a month or 2. We're just going to take down France, and that's going to be the end of it. The Germans are going to beat the British, and yay, we go home. And here they are now in 1942, fighting not only in North Africa, but also in the Soviet Union, and the Italian economy is starting to run on fumes too. So there's a lesson.
I had that question flagged here. Could the Italian economy, already straining, manage to continue its war effort? Because I also don't think. Listen, I got to bring my fellow Italians in here. Love my Italians. We are always on the winning side in every world war. No matter at the end, we're in the right side.
Right.
We're always on the right side at the end. But their economics is tough, man. It's a tough because you have Italian submarines in the Atlantic. You've got the Italian 8th Army in North Africa. You've got the poor Italian 10th Army, which gets destroyed in North Africa. You got forces in East Africa. I mean, Mussolini signs himself up for a very tough conflict, and I think economics is really the element. You have this argument that the Italian economy falls apart, and then you have this other thing. It's like, well, the Italian economy kind of holds together for a portion of it. And so I thought maybe get you to pull a little bit more on that. What do you think? I mean, obviously this is the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean theater becomes so essential in many ways. A lot of people want to call it this secondary theater, the soft underbelly. What's your perspective on that, especially for 1942?
Well, first of all, I feel like the Italians get some bad press, mostly because a lot of the winners write the histories, right? And so the British are allowed to sort of poo-poo the Italians because, of course, the British end up winning in North Africa, and it was fashionable to poo-poo the Italians. I do feel like the Italian military, particularly its army, was no great shakes, but that its men performed credibly when put in situations and roles where they could, do what they could do, which is mostly defensive. They did have some better offensive units like the Trieste Armored Division and Ariete Armored Division as well. But you have to use them carefully, and they're relatively brittle in terms of their forces. Two, their contributions to the Axis alliance out on the Eastern Front is just, unless you're an Eastern Front expert, you don't even know the Italians had an army out there, and yet it's 250,000 men. And the defeat that it ends up suffering at the hands of the Red Army is sort of part of the broader Stalingrad debacle. That Eighth Army, just under Garibaldi, just gets absolutely destroyed, just wiped out. And it's a far larger defeat than the one that happens to them ultimately at Al Alamein. And yet, again, from the Eastern Front, unless you're an Eastern Front person, you don't even know that happened, right? We all focus on what goes down in the Northern Desert. As far as their economy is concerned, I'm sort of with the first view in that their economy doesn't fall apart. It just kind of limps along, and they just don't have the industrial base to keep up with a modern war. They cannot produce a tank that is better than the M1340 that they've had on the books, for 3 years. They can't produce a good aircraft engine that will power a better second generation fighter. They're ending up having to do licensed production of the German DB601 engine because Italian engine firms can't come up with anything that's better. So the argument I make is that the Italians do end up making substantial contributions to the Axis war effort, but they're kind of stuck in place. Their economy is running out of steam at the same time that other economies like the U.S. in particular are just going buzzing. So, yeah.
Yeah, they're in 1939 military fighting, into 1942. And we talked about this in the other episode we did where we were talking about more of the maritime side. The Italian Navy doesn't have radar. I mean, right. they don't have really aircraft attached to them. And they've got a fuel problem. They just don't. Italy did not stockpile anything going in because, again, it's short war mentality. This is going to be a quick war. We're going to fight the French. The British are going to, give us up. We're going to get some territory out of this, and this is going to be done. And they just don't have that. But I also like the idea that you talk about in here that they're not nothing you can dismiss. They are providing a factor here that is a play for the British that they have to deal with. They're contesting the Mediterranean, creating problems for the British. They do cause a lot of issues for them and potentially could be a game changer. The problem is that they are limited in what they can do.
Right. Yeah, I mean, Rommel never would have advanced as far as he did in North Africa without the Italians, in his force. I mean, the Italians supplied the bulk of the infantry for the Panzer Army, and without those troops, he's not able to advance to places like El Alamein. The unfortunate reality then becomes for the Italians that since they're so far less motorized a force, that's primarily leg infantry that's walked all the way to Alamein, that when things go pear-shaped there, they don't have the ability to skedaddle, and that means that the British are going to round up a large group of Italian troops that are just trying to walk out of the desert and make it back to Libya, and that ain't going to get it done. No,
walking from Egypt to Libya to Tunisia. It's not a great. It's not a great trip.
No.
It's not a great backpack rucking exercise you really want to do.
Not at all.
Now we're back. We're very going to be Pacific focused here because we want to talk about Japan and the United States.
Love it.
So for Japan, you note this. Could Japan opening blows compel the U.S. to seek a negotiated settlement rather than fighting a war to the finish? Which I think is a great question because it's like, what is Japan trying to get out of this? What's their objective? What are they trying to achieve? And your analysis, you've studied this intensely. This is obviously one of the fields that you do quite a bit with. What's your view on that?
Basically, Japan is going for the same thing that Germany is going for, which is economic autarky. I want to, have my own trading bloc that has all of the raw materials within it that I need as an economy, and also has captive markets within it that will allow me to sell my goods and no one can mess with me, right? I want a yen block and I need oil is kind of what it comes down to. So short term, they're unleashing this vast offensive that is aimed to the south, which is being done with very little in the way of forces. I mean, the Japanese army at this point is like 51 divisions and change, and they're only going to be using about 11 and a half divisions to capture what is going to turn out to be one of the largest empires in the history of mankind, right? So the way that Pearl Harbor fits into that is tactically offensive but operationally defensive, in that the goal with Pearl Harbor is to knock out the American battle fleet such that they can't come across the Central Pacific and hit the Japanese in the flank as the Japanese are moving south. But the real center of gravity for Japan is south, in Indonesia, Malaya, places like that, because that's where the oil is. We got to go get that stuff. They're hopeful that what's going to happen is that the initial attack at Pearl Harbor is going to be devastating enough. They're going to sink 4, 5, 6 battleships, they hope, and that will then cow the Americans into, screw it, the heck with it. We've had half our battle fleet sunk. Let the Japanese have their ill-gotten gains, and we're going to focus on the more important enemy, which ultimately is Germany. We sort of know that. Of course, none of that comes to pass. And I think you can make a pretty persuasive argument that as soon as Pearl Harbor goes down, that's the end of a negotiated settlement. FDR says in his speech on December 8th, no matter what it may take us to defeat this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. And, he doesn't define what absolute victory is, but it's pretty clear that the underlying intent is, we ain't going to negotiate anything. We're going to curb stomp you, and when we're done with you, then we're going to dictate what our terms are going to be. I would argue that sort of underlying emotional context is not backed up with deeds until you get to Midway. It really is at Midway, in the aftermath of that defeat against the Japanese, that the Americans are now able to say, okay, we've clawed ourselves, back to parity in terms of naval aviation. Yeah, we don't have to negotiate anymore now. Because we know that we have this massive shipbuilding program, lurking in the background. So the war is going to be fought to a finish. The Japanese honestly went into this war without much of a strategy at all, really.
I without a strategy, without a plan,
Yeah.
I just don't know how they think they're going to administer all the territory they have and do it. I mean, if you're the 16th Army commander, you're given Indonesia. It's like, okay, now, congratulations. Now you're not just military conquering Dutch East Indies. Now you got to civilly control it. You got to feed it. You got to extract the resources out of it. It's just. It's such an interesting development for the Japanese, because the Japanese had been able to take French Indochina. They really with no fight whatsoever.
Yeah.
Why didn't they think they could just go into Borneo and take the Dutch East Indies without a fight, or do something? It's because I've heard you had this talk before, because I was kind of the same way. It's like, well, Japan had this ultimate plan in the books to take over Southeast Asia. It had been planned for years and generations. Like, no, this thing is ad hoc on the fly. Yeah. It's like, this is not well planned at all.
It's just like, it's geez, we got an oil embargo. I guess we better come up with a war plan. And I do talk about that in one of the chapters, just discussing what I call the greater East Asian co-impoverishment sphere, because the Japanese do a terrible job of managing the economies of Southeast Asia after they take them over. And some of that is driven by an explicit knowledge on their part that, there's nothing down here except resources to be extracted. And we cannot replace the colonial trading empires that were in this neck of the woods that supplied all the local people with things like light bulbs and nails and cloth and, what have you. The orders that IGHQ issues to their armies are explicitly, y'all are going to have to live off the land and take care of your own supply, because we ain't got the merchant tonnage to even send you your equipment, let alone send all the civilian goods down that they need too. And their attitude to that is, well, you know, the locals are just going to have to deal, and that's what ends up happening.
That's why you have 1 million dead in
Good
Indonesia
Lord.
and massive population problems
Yeah.
down there. It's such a kind of fly by wire what they're doing in some cases, and you know I kind of understand why they do it. I mean you can't go in the Dutch East Indies and leave Singapore in your rear with what's going to be an enhanced Force Z or
Yeah.
Z at some point that comes in. The U.S. is throwing B-17s and subs into the Philippines, and so they're looking at that, and it's just this huge kind of imperialist and, you know, kind of almost mercantilistic view that they want to grab this area,
Yeah.
become self-sufficient. But like you said, they don't even have the tonnage to be self-sufficient,
Right.
and they are behind the power curve the entire time. But the Japanese pull off these amazing feats with almost no forces at times.
Yeah.
Battalions are going in and grabbing things. It's just
Yeah.
it's nutty how they're able to achieve the success, but it's that scale again. You come back to it and you look at the size of that empire that they carve out, and where I mean, from Burma to like Guadalcanal is thousands of miles.
Yeah,
It's
enormous.
crazy insane how big it is.
Yeah, no, it is. It is really big. And to me, one of the most interesting transitions within that year is going from those initial victories in places like Malaya and Burma to fights in, you know, Alligator Creek and Milne Bay, which both happened in August of 1942. Because there are a number of battles at the outset where, you know, you look at the Battle of Slim River, which happens in Malaya in early January of 42. The 11th Indian Division is astride the main road there. The Japanese launch a tank attack against it in the dark at 0300. I mean, first of all, just, you know, doing any sort of armor operation in the dead of night just like chills the blood. You can't even see past your fenders. But in essence, the Japanese take a battalion of motorized infantry, a company of tanks, a couple batteries of field guns, and this little battalion plus sized Kampf group, if you will, destroys 11th Indian Division. I mean, just destroys it. So, and that had happened at Jitra, that's going to end up happening further south at Muar. So there are numerous instances where, yeah, the Japanese are fighting forces that outnumber them 3 or 4 to 1, and they just crush them because their infantry is very, very good and they know what they're doing. So if you take that sort of a mentality, it's easy to see why you end up with battles like Alligator Creek, you know, where Colonel Ichiki or Iki, depending on how you want to pronounce his name, has this notion that, yeah, my reinforced battalion here is going to be able to take on what I think is an American regiment that is around this airfield on Guadalcanal. I'm going to destroy them because, by God, we've been doing that all through the earlier campaigns in Malaya and Burma. It doesn't work.
And I mean, it fits your logistics too, because
Right.
this fast kind of lightning type attack is
Yep.
what you need. You don't need a lot of deep logistics to do it. What we need is enough for the attack, and that's, you know, because the attack's going to be enough to force them out. And I got to think Yamashita has that with Percival at Singapore. It's like, man, this dude outnumbers me, but I've been able to output him. And you know, again, we talk about the victory disease. I don't think it's victory disease. I think it's there is confirmation for what's
Right.
happening here. The Japanese are not you know, it's not like they're delusional. It's like, no, we've kicked their ass
kicked
every
their
friggin'
butts.
time, whether
Yeah.
it's in Malaysia, Philippines, Burma. I mean, we've had these victories. It's like, this is not delusional. We are confident. It's the other allies that start to change. They start to realize it, and they start to make those movements. And we've talked about this before, where maybe the one thing that the allies have, among other things, is their ability to adapt.
Yes.
And change. And it actually leads me over to a question I wanted to ask you about the Eastern Front, because it deals with the Russians for a second.
Yeah.
Could the Red Army, which had suffered a series of almost unimaginable calamities, transform itself into a force capable of not just fighting the Wehrmacht, but also taking the offensive in the Battle of Maneuvers? So one of the sections I read for you, and let me be clear, I want to go back in the book for a second. You have these vignettes at the beginning of some chapters that delve into like tank production, aircraft production. I had to find the ship production one. It's like October, I think it is. I had to go jump ahead and go look at that one. But the Russians undergo a doctrinal change during the, and it's not one, they go through multiple, because they try a couple of things and it doesn't work. Yeah. And 42 is a really interesting year for them to figure out what works for them doctrinally. Should we put our tanks into corps, mobile groups? What I want you to kind of talk about that in a minute, because that's the learning element. The
Yes.
Red Army to me does many things, but man, it does begin to learn. Now it doesn't learn everything right. I mean, they're still wasting manpower into 45 in huge numbers, but they are starting to learn in some ways, and I'm really interested in your take on that.
Yeah, and that's sort of set against a backdrop that I feel we as Americans and Westerners in general just sort of look at the Soviets and the Russians and describe them as these sort of, these wooden automatons, they're very rigid and they're not adaptable. And I would make the argument that in 42, at least, the Red Army is proving that it is one of the most ferociously adaptable organizations on the planet. That there's a recognition as soon as the calamities on the frontiers happen in the summer of 41 on the part of the Stavka, that Jesus, the Germans are so much better than we are at making war, and we have got to completely remake the Red Army. So they end up tearing apart their organizational chart not once but twice in the course of about 15 months. And the first thing they do is they just tear it all down into little Lego blocks, because they recognize that they're bigger formations like these mechanized corps, which are 30,000 guys and 400 tanks or whatever, just more than 400, are just completely unwieldy, and they've all been destroyed anyway. And their officer corps is younger and less experienced and can't maneuver a formation that big either. And so they tear all of their armored formations down into separate brigades of, in some cases, as few as 27 tanks, usually more in the 50-ish range. And so, okay, now they got these little Lego blocks that they're handing out to the rifle division commanders to help shore them up and, do local counterattacks and that kind of stuff. But one of the things they sort of come to realize by the time you get to the beginning of 42 is these little separate brigades just don't have the staying power in the field, because they haven't got all of the organic logistical stuff that goes along with a real, like a Panzer division. You got a motor pool, you got a mechanical pool to repair things, you've got medical detachments, you got recon, you got all these other supporting elements. That's really what gives a Panzer division its sustainability in the field. And so the Russians are kind of like, we need something like that. And so what you see happening in 42 then is that the Red Army's force structure is being built back up again. You see first the introduction of their tank corps, which are about 6,000 guys, and then later on in the year they're going to reintroduce a new, smaller version of the mechanized corps, which is roughly the equivalent of a Panzer division. And at the same time that that's all going on, first of all, they're also arming their rifle formations with a lot more automatic weapons, both submachine guns and heavy machine guns. They are putting more organic anti-tank guns into those formations to give them a little more viability against German tank attacks. They've pulled a lot of their artillery out of the rifle divisions and sucked them up the org chart, and they're using them in artillery regiments and in some cases artillery divisions that are under centralized Stavka control, that have experts, in laying out these fire plans. But the net result is that by the time you get to Stalingrad, now the Red Army has got these bigger, beefier armored formations, and they've also taken their whole deep battle methodology back off the shelf again. That had been shelved because Tukhachevsky, who is the proponent of deep battle, was executed in 37, and so, things that were associated with Tukhachevsky were not super popular at the time if you wanted to keep your neck. And so deep battle goes up on the shelf, but now they pull it back off, and now they've got units that can actually execute this sort of deep, sequential, layered offensive into the depths of the enemy rear. That's what deep battle is supposed to do. All of that kind of comes together in a fairly neat package by the time you get to Stalingrad. And this is the first time the Red Army has actually been able to sustain a counterattack, a battle of maneuver against the Wehrmacht, and actually win.
Yeah, that Soviet development, I think, is so interesting. I remember
Yeah,
I
it's
taught at
really
West Point
interesting.
years ago, and we went into very doctrinal things, and one of those things was the Soviets and their change, and a lot of criticism the fact that the Soviets didn't embrace this deep battle earlier. But in truth, they didn't need it earlier. What they needed is now in 42, where they're going to do these exploitation attacks. And it goes back to the heart of what a Panzer regiment is, or a Panzer division is. A Panzer division is not tanks. Tanks are only one small slice of that mix. It's one of the reasons why the Germans can double their Panzer divisions from 10 to 20 going into the invasion of Russia, because they know it's also motorized infantry, it's motorized tanks, it's all those logistics. Those tank brigades are great because you can put them in with a division, or move them around to be stopgaps to fill the gaps and kind of do that. But if you want to do the deep battle, if you want to do those penetrations like the Germans did against the Soviets in the summer of 41, when they destroyed 4 million Soviet.
Yeah.
I mean, they destroyed the entire Red Army in terms of they got to replace
The
an
entire Red Army. Yeah.
yeah, and so you've got to be able to do it. But to me, that's really interesting, that doctrinal shift, because even the Soviets are learning. It's like, we got to figure this out and how to change. And you can make the argument that the Allies are better across the board at really implementing these doctrinal changes.
Yes and
doing
no. I mean, because if I take you to the northern desert, I would argue that the British Army is much poorer at learning about the value of combined arms than the Soviets were. And so, here's an instance where, yeah, we sort of poo-poo the Ruskies as not being adaptable. And yet, you look at the performance of British Eighth Army in the northern desert, and they just cannot wrap their heads around the fact that tanks and infantry work better together, and they pay for it over and over and over again. They just get shellacked because they make these sort of cavalry charges using their tank brigades that just get wrecked by German groups that have anti-tank guns integrated into the mix.
So did you see? And again, I apologize, I hadn't read everything yet. So, but did you see that kind of lining up with the doctrines month for month? So if you're at Gazala, for example, with the Eighth Army in North Africa, with what the Soviets are doing at that period of time, or Al Mahalfa,
Yeah.
in August in 42.
Well, it's sort of interesting in that Auchinleck, who is the commander of Eighth Army up until right after the first Battle of El Alamein in July, Auchinleck, I think, had a sense for the necessity of combined arms, and he was trying to do things to mix it up in Eighth Army and create more of these mixed packages. And he, of course, he ends up being tossed out in early August by Churchill, and you put Montgomery in instead. Montgomery doesn't have a clue. Montgomery doesn't have a clue about that. But what Montgomery does have is a really good artillery commander in the form of Sidney Kirkman, who comes in. And if you look at the battle plan for Alamein as a whole, yes, the British are using tank divisions and infantry divisions in roughly the same location, but they're not actually supposed to be operating together. But what ends up happening is that by this point in time, Eighth Army's artillery arm has just metastasized into this incredibly lethal force. They've got 908 artillery tubes in their inventory, and Sidney Kirkman just knows how to do crazy things, using hundreds of barrels at a time to be able to flexibly bring down fire. They called it a stonk. And so any German or counterattack that would try to be forming up there out in the desert, as soon as the RAF comes back and says, "Yo, there's a big concentration of German mechanized units in this location," boom, down comes the rain. So I look at Alamein, honestly, it's more of a World War I kind of battle. It's very set piece, it's methodical, it is artillery oriented, but it ends up being ultimately very effective.
And I mean, the logistics for that is the other element, that you can bring in that much artillery. I mean, again, we're talking about the Western Desert. It's a long haul going around Africa to get there, but that's part of that other fight that we're talking about, is that their ability to kind of really handle this type of logistics pushed up against the Suez, Alexandria. You've cleared out the the Red Sea, East Africa by this point, and now you get a more free movement to do it. But again, that comes at the expense of other areas where you're denuding them of forces, and so you don't have enough forces there. For example, in Burma, for example, because we're putting everything into
Right.
into North Africa at the time.
Which, from a political standpoint, Churchill is desperate for a win. He's got to have a victory to show to the British people, particularly before Britain's contributions to this war begin to be overshadowed by the American contribution. So it's absolutely vital that the Brits win on their own in the northern desert, and that's what Alamein gives them.
Did you find, because again I apologize I hadn't read through everything, but did you find that really the kind of
Make apologies, man.
I know 1,000 pages, John. It's 1,000 pages.
Yeah,
I don't know who you're going to get to do the audio version of this, but whoever it is going to be.
he's a guy over in Wisconsin. They sent me some of his audio samples to listen to. I did briefly contemplate the notion of trying to read it myself, and I sort of did a little mini sort of audition. And after reading like 3 paragraphs of this, I was like, oh, no, I'm not going to do this.
This is long. I don't know how long. I don't know how long the audio version of this is going to be, but it's going to be
2 hours. Right?
That is an entire audible account right there. That's what you do.
Anyway, good.
But
Go on.
good diversion.
Yeah.
But did you? I mean, how dangerous was Churchill's position at that point?
Bad.
Is his prime ministership in challenge at that point, or is he still in a pretty good position?
He's in a bad position. And honestly, if you look at again, July of 42 is a really bad month. There's an editorial in the New York Times that month that calls on FDR to turn over leadership of the war to a military officer and name someone to be supreme commander. That doesn't bespeak a whole lot of confidence on the part of the civilian. The New York Times is pretty friendly to FDR, and to get that sort of an editorial, even in the wake of Midway, that gives you a sense for just how the war was being viewed on the home front. Meanwhile, in Britain, in July, Churchill has to survive a vote of no confidence in Parliament because it's been a dumpster fire. It's been horrific the first few months, and he survives that vote relatively easily. But it goes to show that there were a lot of people on the British home front that were like, this is not a guy who's putting together a winning team. We keep getting our butts kicked in the desert. We've lost all of our Asian colonies. It's just everything is horrible. Winston, you need to make it better.
42 for Churchill is like, and he seems to be always in Washington D.C. when something bad happens.
Yeah,
I mean, you lose 4C, you lose Singapore, you lose Burma, you lose Tobruk. It's just one disaster after another, and it's just like, and again, go back to put yourself into that position. It's like, this is not good. You're trying to get a dozen Spitfires into Malta, and they're getting destroyed as soon as they land.
Right.
It's not good. And like you said, and if you're watching that map on the New York Times of the front line in the Soviet Union, you can sit there and say, well, the Soviets lost, the Germans lost at the gates of Moscow. But meanwhile, you're watching that bulge come out in southern Russia, and it's just like, it's heading to the Caucasus, it's heading to Turkey, it's heading to the Caspian Sea, it's going to cut the Volga, which is the supply line that the Russians need. I mean, things are really, really bad. Bleak. And that takes us to the last one, and obviously that is the United States here.
Yeah.
Could the U.S. economy quickly move onto a wartime footing and begin contributing to the larger American cause? And I think this is such an interesting one, because if you look at the United States, and we've had this conversation, if you look at what the United States is doing in 1937, 38, 39, what they wind up doing later on is crazy. I mean, it's just, I don't think anyone would buy what Roosevelt was saying in terms of aircraft, tank, and ship production. And if I'm the Germans, the Italians, or the Japanese, like, I don't believe this guy.
No, they're looking at that and they're like, yeah, right, you're going to produce 100,000 planes next year. Sure. And because they knew that their economies couldn't do it, and had a sense that, the Americans, even with as big an economy as they had, there's no way that they can switch from making toasters and refrigerators over to making, warships and aircraft in that time. And yet we did. A lot of that is primed by the fact that Lend-Lease contracts for the British had sort of kind of jump-started that transition of the economy. but we're also very good at improvisation. So, for instance, in terms of tank production, we had exactly one tank factory in the country, the Detroit Chrysler Tank Arsenal. And we're then looking around, it's like, okay, who else can make tanks? We need a factory that has, big overhead cranes to handle really heavy castings and that kind of stuff. And what we ended up landing on for the first half of the war is all of our railroad engine companies. Press Steel and Putnam and Lima Locomotive, and these companies have been languishing during the Depression with very poor business. And then all of a sudden, the U.S. government comes in late 1941, 42, and is waving around these cost plus contracts. You've got a guaranteed profit margin on these puppies. We need you to make tanks. And all of them are like, hallelujah, brother, and we do. So, within the course of a single year, the U.S. puts together 24,000 plus armored fighting vehicles in that one year and becomes the world's largest tank producer. It's just jaw-dropping. Could we do that again? No, probably not. But, at this point in time, we really were the world's workshop. And not only that, there was still a lot of headroom in our economy, in that whereas the German and the British economy by this point in the war they're absolutely maxed out. They're running flat out at this point. We still had a lot of productive capacity that was unused, and we have a highly trained, very literate workforce that is looking for work. And the result is that there's not only, productive capacity there that can be accelerated, but there's this massive migration of workers that ends up happening. David Kennedy, in his book Freedom from Fear, I'm just looking at it over on my shelf here, and I would say if anybody wants to get into this topic in depth, David Kennedy's Freedom from Fear and Maury Klein's A Call to Arms are just the books to read.
Right.
They're massive tomes. But Kennedy describes this sort of situation where it's as if our country suddenly is tilted to the north and to the west. And you've got this massive migration out of the South of people that are sort of marginally employed, either out to the aircraft and shipyard factories out on the West Coast, or up to, the northern Great Lakes area where the automotive industry is centered. So you think about the fact that you could be a black woman in the South working as a housekeeper, making maybe $350 a week part-time. All I have to do is get on a train and move to Pasadena and go to work in one of the aircraft factories out there. I'm all of a sudden making $10 a day, and I'm solidly middle class overnight. Those kind of salaries spoke for themselves. And
you're out of Jim Crow.
Yeah.
And so,
right.
So I think that's, reading that through the book and seeing that is the fact that the U.S. is not only able to do that economically, but also to field, 90 some plus divisions and multiple air forces around the world, and a Navy that's going to be second to none. And it's a phenomenal element. But again, when Roosevelt makes those promises, and this is a period of time too when, again, you're reading the book, it's like, okay, here's a scratched together Marine division in Guadalcanal that's like desperate for anything. Yeah. And it's like, I don't need 100,000 airplanes. I need a dozen. Right. I just need, I need 12 SPDs and 19 F4Fs. Yeah. That's what I got. Yeah. 100,000 sounds great. I'll be happy with 30, right. Just get them to me. And it's tough to get them to me right now because it's such an effort, and this, which is.
I was just going to say, this is not to say that there are not some ferocious arguments that go on within the U.S. over the allocation problem. I mean, you mentioned that the Army ends up with 90 divisions. They wanted 225 when they came into this war, because they're looking at a future. If Russia goes down in the dark, we're now going to have to field the majority of the land forces to crush the Reich. And, 90 divisions ain't going to get it done. We need hundreds. But what gets pointed out to the Army by the civilian production experts is you can't do that. If we put that many people in uniform, A, of all, we haven't got the logistics to support that big an army, and B, you're going to take all of these workers out of the factories, and it really is our factories that are the force multipliers, because not only are they supplying our own armies, but they are also pouring out Lend-Lease, which is like a quarter of our economic output, to arm the British, to arm the Russians, to arm all these other people, so that we don't have to do the fighting in places like, the Caucasus or whatever. So, there are these really violent debates, the great feasibility debate, they call it, and I talk about this in the book, where these civilian experts are like telling the military, giving them the news that they do not want to get in terms of, here's how many men and how many people we can put in airplanes. You can't have everything you want.
Right, and they got. I mean, the other element too you have with the U.S. is holding the line in 42. That's really the big thing, because that Navy is coming online, but it's going to be there in 43,
Right.
and the Eighth Air Force is we got the Eighth Air Force in 42. It's going to start its bombing offensive, but man, you're not going to get there till late 43,
Yes.
44 when you start seeing that come in, and it's such. What I found interesting about looking at these 7 nations and these questions we looked at is how they're all slices of the overall image, and we didn't even go into all of them. You got about 3 of them for each of these each of these groups. So I think that's the thing that I got most from the book. John, I have to ask this question too, because I always love to ask it of any author who writes a book. What was, and it's probably gonna be hard for you to answer because it's such a big book. Was there an aha moment? Was there something like, man, I did not know that, I didn't get that, or was it just nonstop throughout this book?
Yeah,
Like,
I mean, I got the same question from Jeremy Collins down at the World War II Museum. I'm going to be down there for an event later on this month. He's like, "What was the one big aha moment?" I'm like, "If there were just one aha moment, I wouldn't have written 1,000 pages of text, right?"
That's what I can imagine. I could probably go in each chapter and get an aha moment
Right.
for you for each element in it.
I will say that one of the things that did sort of open my eyes when I was going through the bomber war and looking at Bomber Command just has a terrible year. I mean, it's awful for
yeah.
them. Yeah, they're taking, statistically speaking, it was the most dangerous year to be flying. They suffer an aggregate around 4.9% attrition rate through all of their missions, which is ugly, And people don't really have a good understanding of what 3% versus 4% versus 5% is in terms of dead bodies on the ground. But it's basically, if you go from 3% attrition to 5% attrition, you're doubling your monthly body count. It's horrific. And that was kind of one of the realizations that I came to, that I feel like with Masters of the Air in particular, there's sort of this popular perception here on this side of the pond that, oh my God, 8th Air Force was the most dangerous military duty ever. And I'm sorry, it just ain't true. First of all, 8th Air Force, statistically speaking, wasn't as dangerous as serving in our submarine force, which is, you had about a 12.7% chance of dying if you were a submariner. 8th Air Force is a lot lower than that. If you start grinding the numbers on Bomber Command, their planes flew lower, they were flying in the dark, they had fewer exits from the airplane, and in the Lancaster they were much smaller too. If you were a big dude in a Lancaster with a parachute, you ain't getting out of that bird. Which meant that if you were in a B-17 or a B-24 and you get shot down, you have about between 2/3 and 3/4 of a chance, you're going to get to the ground alive. 66 to 75% of our guys get out of the plane. If you're in a Halifax, your odds of getting out of that plane alive are 1 in 4. If you are in a Lancaster, your odds are 1 in 7. So when you grind the numbers and also take into account the fact that Bomber Command, even flying at night, was taking higher per sortie casualties than 8th Air Force was flying during the day, it's 3 times as dangerous to be in a Bomber Command plane as it is to be in 8th Air Force. Wrap your head around that. And the same is true of some of their other forces as well. Their submarine force is 3 times as dangerous as our submarine force. Their merchant marine, more than 3 times as dangerous as our merchant marine. So I just think it's important that we as Americans understand we had great allies in this war. The Australians, the New Zealanders, punched well above their weight, and the British really, made a substantial contribution to ultimate victory and paid a much higher per capita cost in so doing. I think that's an important thing to bring out.
No, I think the combined effort there, it really spells out. I mean, when you look at the armies of Eighth Army, you look at what's fighting in New Guinea at the time, and even in Malaya with the Eighth Australians
Yeah.
being there, and
Division.
throughout that, the West Africans in Burma later on. I mean, it definitely turns into a really unique thing. John, we've talked about this book a lot, and I can't thank you enough. I got to ask a couple of more things. What do you got going on? I know you are probably pushing the book right now, so
Yeah.
a lot of talks about the book right now. But I know you and Seth are heading on the road soon, heading down to Texas for a couple of events. What's the big things you got going on here
It's
next?
a really busy, yeah, it's going to be a busy year. Seth and I will be down in Texas at the Audie Murphy World War II History Roundtable in August, on August 20th. I will be back in Texas again in early September at the National Museum of the Pacific War, and I'll be back for their conference in October as well. I'm going to be down at the World War II Museum on June 24th for an authors event there. I will be back there for their annual conference in November. So yeah, I'm just doing a lot of little short trips here. People are also asking, okay, well, what's next? And, are you going to write?
I Get me clear. I was not even going to ask you because after this, I think you don't need to write a thing for a while.
I talk about this at the end of the book too. I did set this book up structurally to be able to do a 1943 or a 1944. I just don't think I've got another 17-year book project in me, which 44 honestly would warrant. And two, I feel like in the course of this book, I'm really sort of laying out kind of my unified field theory of why the Allies won the war. And I would just end up repeating myself in subsequent books. I don't really want to do that. So I'm mulling a couple of biographies. I'm kind of kicking around. There's some other potential projects, maybe even one with Tony. That could be on the docket. I don't know. I'm not going to make a commitment to another book here for a little bit. I think got to push this.
I would think if I am Oxford University Press, I would use your book as a template for a series and try to get other authors to kind of plug that in together. Kind of like the Oxford History of the United States that they did a long
Yeah.
time ago and everything. But that would be, I think, an interesting one for me. I am kind of query on one question you had because I was going to ask you this: is like if you were going to do another one, what year would you do that would
44.
be next? Because 44 is the logical one. That's the one I came up with too because that's obviously the big one because that is the one where the coil is let loose, it's sprung.
Yeah.
And everything. And I got to say, I've been really intrigued by 43 a lot right now. I don't know what it is. There's been some elements in 43 that get me. It's like, this is not as good a year as we think it
No.
is. And it's a really important year. And there's like some crazy things that the Allies do that come very close to not working. Salerno,
Yeah.
New Georgia. I mean, this is a couple of times that where I'm looking at what the Allies are doing. It's like, oh, this could really blow back in your face if you're not very careful.
Right. Yeah, certainly in the Pacific too. You look at the campaign that's going on in New Guinea and in the Solomons. We managed to chew our way, 300 miles up the Solomons in the course of a year, and take the Finchhaven Peninsula and the Huon Peninsula in New Guinea. Woohoo. And there are people back in D.C. that are looking at that and they're like, dudes, at this rate of advance, we're not going to be in Tokyo until the 1960s. Can we move things along?
Right.
Yeah. But what's happening, of course, behind the scenes, out of the view of your average viewer, I guess, man or woman on the street, again, the correlation of forces, and I use that in sort of the classic Soviet sense, in that there are all these soft factors that are underlying military effectiveness. The Americans are putting together their brand new carrier fleet. They're extending their logistical apparatus. We've got the supply squadrons and, all of that stuff is being put together. We got better fighters now. We got better pilots. And so all of these things are going to come together at the beginning of 1944. And as you say, we just blow the doors off of this thing and advance completely across the Pacific in that 1 year. Because, yeah, things have changed dramatically in terms of the underpinnings during 43.
Yeah, it's such a tonal shift.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at 40, 42 to 44, I mean, it's so crazy.
Yeah.
How that transpires.
What are you,
So, John,
gonna-
I can't thank you.
what are you working on at this point? Got to ask you that.
First of all, I'm trying to get out of Hormuz with my channel right
Right,
now.
right. Yeah, you've been doing nothing but Hormuz for like 4 months, right?
So I'm kind of like you. I've got another year teaching right now coming ahead, and then I'm hoping for a sabbatical to finish up my book on World War One. I've been working on that quite a bit, so I'm trying to get that done. And in the process, I've been digging up and doing the information on logistics in early World War Two. That's the big one. That's the next project that's coming together.
I so want to see that. And
I actually got some articles put together. I'm going to try to get some. I got to get some articles out to get more written stuff out of there. And I got to do more of my writing than what I'm doing now. That's always my big thing is I got to sit down. I am not as good as you, and I'm sure the hell not as good as Seth in banging out writing as fast as he does. It's just it's always amazing.
No, Seth really can crank it out. I will offer too that if you need maps for that World War One or World War II logistics book in the Pacific, I know a guy. So
I will say again, and I'm going to have them up here during the course of this video and show some of them. Absolutely phenomenal work. I mean, you just outstanding work on those maps. They were really, really good and very clear. I like the format you use, not the traditional kind of, a little bit different, which is nice and everything like that. So very easy to follow and represent. I thought it was really good. I kept he always got me is like, okay, I'm looking at an army group here, and then next page, okay, here's a company at Alligator Creek. It's like the scale is so tremendous.
Yeah.
And then, of course, every week you can follow you over at the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. You and Seth do a great job. You're in season 6 now. You guys are hitting the period I love, man. You're doing early. I mean, season 5 was great because you were early World War II in the Pacific, but you're hitting right now the Philippines, going over that area. It's such a good one. I mean, you're going to be talking about obviously everything happening in that area, what's going on with Leyte and all those other areas. I just think it's a great one for you guys to be doing. You guys do such a great job, and like you said, you hosted me twice last season on there, which is two times too many.
No. We're scheming on ways to bring you back. So yeah, our audience digs having you as well. We've had a number of really good guests, and so yeah, we're always looking for opportunities. So thank you.
Listen, I strongly have the link in the show notes here for everybody to head over there, and of course I will have the link over to 1942 Crux of War. This should come with a warning not to read this at night in bed for fear that you may be suffocated by it at night. I joked with John when we did our last episode. I don't have it here, but I got my copy of Shattered Sword, and it has a rip on it on the binding because I literally dropped it. And I think I almost broke my foot that time. I dropped it one time. This would kill me.
It'll hurt you. It's definitely a part of any person's personal fitness program. It can be incorporated for curls and all sorts of good stuff. So.
Listen, you could put a Tai Chi for 50-year-olds because that's one of your market demographics right there that we could be using this for lifting and everything. Yeah. What's the reception you've gotten on the book so far?
It's been very good.
Good.
Okay, so here we are. We're recording on June 15th. The book is not officially supposed to release for 3 more days.
18th is official day, and I'm going to have the link on Amazon and all the sites so you can get it.
So the first printing was relatively large, and the first half of that, which is around 5,000 copies, is already gone. So I'm having to order more books for myself because I've got events coming up, and we're waiting for the not as officially the second printing. It's the second half of the first printing, but nevertheless, I mean, the fact that those books are already sold would tend to be a fairly good indication that it seems to be well received. I mean, certainly I've been getting good feedback on Facebook from people. They're at the beginning of that journey, though. We'll see how they actually feel about the book once they make it to like August. I don't know. We'll see how that goes.
You mean August in the book, or August to getting through the book and actually?
It'll probably be August before you get to August. So that's kind of how it works.
Well, John, if I'm a savvy publisher and kind of marketeer, you have a good following. You have a solid following. I can say when you were on my channel last, it was a huge viewing, and I got to imagine if Jon Parshall puts a book together, it's going to sell. And so I think you are in a good position to clear out 5,000 copies and go to another printing here soon.
Hope so.
I just think it is a phenomenal work. I've heard you talk about it for so long, and I'm just very happy. I know what a struggle it is to put a book together, and it's the behind the scenes, it's those maps, it's the editing, it's the footnotes, it is a labor of love in some ways.
Yeah, or a labor of obsessive compulsion or something. Yeah, I don't know, but yeah, more therapy needed.
So I just can't help. I got to ask one more question because it makes me wonder. What was the first thing you wrote in the book? What was the last thing you wrote in the book? Because most people think, I wrote this sequentially. It's like, no, most people don't ever write a book sequentially. They kind of jump back and forth. But what was kind of the first thing you put to paper, and what was the last?
I did do it track by track, that is theater by theater, and the Pacific track was the first one that I did because it was much easier to organize my thinking just end to end by a theater. So I wrote the whole, December to December of the Pacific, and it was way too big. When I came back to it about 5 years ago and redid it, that took it way down. The last thing I wrote, honestly, was, though, the conclusion to the book. And that was sort of, I did not know what I was going to say other than, if I haven't convinced you in the course of 1,000 pages that, 1942 is the critical year of the war, then I don't know what I'm going to tell you at this point in time, right? So, but that was kind of fun to sort of try to wrap things up and go even one level higher, I guess I would say, and also to hopefully leave some lessons for the reader to hopefully take forward when they are reading smaller, more rationally sized books, that you always have to keep the big picture context in mind. That even when we're sitting in a foxhole with Eugene Sledge on Okinawa, and the only thing he can think about, obviously, is just what a miserable experience he's having in this particular foxhole, all this big picture stuff is still swirling around in the background, and we need to be aware of it, even if Sledge himself is not talking about, the larger war against Japan or what have you. You can't really understand the war without thinking about the whole war.
Yeah, it's the entirety of it, which is so massive, and it's so complex, and it's so interrelated. It's when I was on, we were talking about logistics. It's it's a loss of tankers on the East Coast is impacting Guadalcanal.
Sure.
It's like you don't think about that, but it is because now all of a sudden that supply chain is being encumbered. Same thing with the supply chain going to Russia for Lend-Lease and those materials. I think that's a great one. And so, John, I want to thank you again for taking way too much time out to talk about this.
I really appreciate it. Thank you for giving me a free plug for my book for an hour and a half. Thanks so much for having me on. It's been great.
No, it's always a pleasure, John. And listen, any chance that we get together and talk about it, I am all for it. So I want to thank Jon Parshall and everybody for tuning in today. If you want a copy of John's book, you can order it now. I'll have the link down below and over there so you can get it. Beware. Don't lift this thing without, proper bracing and support. But you are, by money, pound for pound, you're getting the best deal of World War II material you will get. I guarantee you that. And it will leave you wanting more because that's what Jon Parshall does. And you can follow Jon Parshall. I'll have his link so that you can find him. I'll have the link over to the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast so you can follow him there. Every week, Tuesday is one of my favorite days. I'm listening to you guys while I'm driving to work and then sitting there at work listening to you and Seth going at it. So I appreciate everybody for tuning in. John, thank you again.
Thanks.
And until our next episode, Sal, signing off.